not the time to shirk. We can do it.
Welcome to We Can Do It, a Canadian podcast focused on climate change, the environment, and nuclear energy. Welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm joined by James Scongack, who is the chair of the Nuclear Isotope Council and an executive at Bruce Power. James, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks for having me, Chris.
So, James, I'd like to learn a little bit more about my guests on a personal level. So maybe you can tell me a little bit, pretend you're at a dinner party, how you would sort of explain yourself and how you got to where you are in life.
No, it's a good question. So I grew up and still live in a small town in southwestern Ontario called Port Elgin. My father worked most of his career at the Bruce Nuclear Power Development, as it was known at the time. And growing up in the area, I always was very interested in technology and energy issues, and had the opportunity 17 years ago to return to my home community and join Bruce Power.
Okay, so runs in the family, eh? And this is going back to what, like Douglas Point days, or in terms of your father?
No, my father joined Ontario Hydro at the time in the 1980s, and he spent his career primarily working at the Bruce Heavy Water Plant, because at that particular time we were actually producing heavy water here in Ontario. So he carried out that role until the heavy water plant closed in the late 1990s. And then from that point in his career was a paramedic on site in the fire department.
Cool. Yeah. So we're definitely going to talk about heavy water, as that's sort of a pretty distinctly Canadian thing. And we'll get into the history. But today's show is on medical isotopes, which is, I guess, a lesser known expression of nuclear technology, and probably doesn't get quite enough credit in terms of, its benefits to human health and even lives saved. I'm sure these numbers are probably hard to estimate, but I've seen numbers like hundreds of millions of lives saved. I mean, in my own family, my father has a cancer that was diagnosed and is being treated partially with radiation. So, and even just, the medical imaging test that we get, it really touches us. And, most Canadians will have a family member that has probably benefited in some way, shape, or form from medical isotopes. So that's really what I wanted to go into detail with you today. For our listeners, I mean, we have a broad, mostly fairly well-educated group of listeners, but for people that we're trying to welcome into the fold, and myself included, I'm a medical doctor. I had a lot to learn researching this episode. Could you just go through what, an isotope is, and then what a radioisotope is, and maybe what a medical isotope is?
Right. Well, maybe we just keep it simple and just talk about isotopes, because I think sometimes what happens is for those of us that work in the business, we're so fascinated by the technology, Chris, that sometimes we let that dominate the narrative. And at times that doesn't mean anything to people outside of those who are in the business. And I would agree with you that at the end of the day, I think this is a true Canadian success story. I think it has the potential, in addition to the climate change items with nuclear power, which I know you talk a lot about, really has the ability to transform people's perspective on the nuclear industry, because we don't have a modern healthcare system without medical isotopes. And when I describe a medical isotope to people, I very much look at it as just another form of energy. We generate electricity to power our homes, business, schools, and hospitals. And really all a medical isotope is another form of energy. It's a form of energy that we can produce in a nuclear reactor, in an accelerator as well. And I often say both, because there can sometimes be a myth, Chris, that you don't need nuclear reactors, that you have accelerators. The truth is you need both. Reactors can't do what accelerators can do, and accelerators can't do what reactors do. And that's why the Canadian Nuclear Isotope Council has both the accelerator community and the reactor community. So I look at an isotope as a form of energy that we're able to harvest from a reactor or an accelerator, and we use that form of energy for medical purposes. We use it to sterilize medical equipment. We use it to diagnose, as you noted in the case of your father, I believe, diagnose certain forms of cancer, and to treat forms of cancer. And so an isotope is all it really is just another form of energy that we use for medical purposes.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to get into some of the specific isotopes down the road a little bit, and I think that combination of what's produced at the reactor and then how it's modified on site. I think with the example of molybdenum, But before we get there, let's talk about a few more of those specific uses that you mentioned. So you mentioned sterilization of surgical instruments. You mentioned some of the treatments in terms of, like, I think most people would be familiar with like radiation oncology and sort of beam radiation, and that's probably done in a few ways. But are isotopes involved in that in terms of generating like, say, gamma radiation for certain treatments?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, it's a very broad field. So if you take a look at, I'll just give you one example in the case of what we do at Bruce Power. So we produce a type of medical isotope called cobalt-60, and I'm sure we'll talk more about cobalt-60 later in terms of sterilization. But we've also modified our production of cobalt-60 to produce what we call a high specific activity cobalt-60. And that high specific activity cobalt-60, it's harvested from our reactors. It's processed by Ottawa-based Nordion. And that high specific activity cobalt-60 is used in the treatment of brain tumors. So you may have heard before a technology called the gamma knife. It's a treatment that is produced by a company called Electa. And essentially what that treatment does is it concentrates a series of what I would call radioactive beams, just to put it simply, concentrates it into one part of the tumor and targets the tumor and destroys it. So there's so many different ways. I mean, you can look at the work that Triumph, for example, that they do with their particle accelerator in British Columbia. They actually have such short-lived isotopes that they're connected directly to the University of British Columbia and transfer those isotopes right over. And that's in the case of an accelerator. So obviously there's a lot of different applications. But if you look at, for example, and we have some great videos on our website on this, but if you look in particular at the gamma knife treatment, the thing that is great about the gamma knife treatment, and there's even new treatments known as the gamma pod, which targets certain types of breast cancer as well. The advantage of it, and you would understand this better than anybody as a physician, is sometimes these tumors can be, especially in the brain, can be very, very difficult to surgically get at. And you can cause a tremendous amount of damage to, other functions in trying to tackle those brain tumors. So that's really where the gamma knife has been so successful in brain tumors. And Bruce Power through Nordion, we're the world's largest provider of that medical grade cobalt.
Right. So in terms of Canada's position in the world with medical isotopes, where do we stand? I understand in researching this a little bit, Netherlands, Australia are major producers. Is Canada, punch above its weight? And if so, why?
Yeah, Canada has always punched above our weight in this territory. And I know you mentioned you had Jeremy Whitlock on a previous session. I mean, Jeremy is the historian when it comes to nuclear technology in Canada and would articulate it better than me. But yes, we have always been global leaders in the production of medical isotopes. And the way I sort of look at it, Chris, is if you think about it, you had modern medicine expand on what I would call is a rocky foundation. We started making medical isotopes in research reactors. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That made sense, right? As we were developing this technology, we used, look at the NRU, 50 years of operation, what that did for Canadians and people throughout the world.
And that's one of our big, I guess it's closed now, but that was a big research reactor at Chalk River.
That's right.
Which grew out of our really early research, initially when the UK moved their atomic research to Canada because they were getting bombed by the Germans, and then moved all of that research center to Canada. And I guess Canada was the second largest nuclear research center outside of the US in the world, first operational nuclear reactor outside of the US. And of course, after the war, turned to peaceful purposes and isotopes. But yeah, the NRU you mentioned, carry on from there. I just wanted to a whirlwind tour of the history for
you're right on the money there. And so what happened really globally was you had the demand for medical isotopes grow as we got into more and more modern medicine. And we see that in Canada. I mean, you know better than anybody, Chris, think of how much medicine has changed in 40 years. And so the demand for these isotopes continued to grow, but the assets that were producing the isotopes were aging and they weren't replaced with anything.
Right.
So a lot of people criticized the NRU, I think, quite unfairly when they had supply interruptions because they had maintenance to do.
Right. There's no backup. There was no.
No, there wasn't. And there was never built in. So what we're trying to do at Bruce Power is we look at it a little differently and say power reactors to generate electricity, they're built to be redundant. So on the Bruce site today, we have 1 unit off on refurb and we have 1 unit off on outage. We have 6 operating. So the people of Ontario can continue to rely on a reliable supply of electricity. And that's why we have a fleet. The same, Chris, is the case in terms of medical isotopes. So while there are other countries, I think, doing awesome work in this space, between the work that is being done at Bruce Power, at OPG's Darlington facility, at OPG's Pickering facility, Canada is by far a world leader in this space. And part of the reason why we're a world leader is not just because of obviously that history that you've talked about, which is right on the money, but is because we have CANDU reactors that have a unique ability to produce medical isotopes, CANDU reactors that are power reactors that can produce them, and such a large fleet of them that we can provide that redundancy. And so look, I think we're just scratching the surface of this. I think the demand for medical isotopes is going to astronomically increase. And the problem global healthcare is going to have is, do we have a reliable, low-cost supply of them? And that's where Canada, I think, can step in a way that nobody else can.
So you mentioned when the NRU had to go down for maintenance and eventually permanently close, I believe in 2016, that there were big supply interruptions. Can you talk about what that looked like, what the impact was in Canada and globally?
Well, just like if you relied on a facility to generate electricity, and that was the only facility generating electricity, and it had to have a planned outage, you don't have that supply. And so like electricity, the modern healthcare, both here in Canada and around the world, it's powered by isotopes, whether it's sterilization, and I can show you a few props in a second, the diagnostic work and the treatment work. So when that supply is not available and that supply is not redundant, you're going to have supply interruptions. And that's really, for example, Chris, one of the things that we did was the high specific activity cobalt-60 that I referred to, that used to be produced at Chalk River. We stepped in and replaced that. And now we have 4 reactors at Bruce B that produce it. So you're not relying just on one. So look, I think the NRU did a fantastic job.
Yeah.
I mean, like what those folks did at now the current CNL, they were the pioneers globally. And so anybody that looks at the NRU as anything but an outstanding global success is just being unfair. And so I think now that they have developed that foundation for Canada, and frankly, the development of CANDU technology, we're able to take that foundation and say, how do we use our power reactors to supply that globally?
We talked about the gamma knife so far, and that's a very kind of specialized, really, really important, high tech version of the use of medical isotopes. But I think things that people are more familiar with, but take for granted, would be the sterilization of, medical instruments,
right,
pharmaceuticals, PPE, right? I mean, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I spent the first month just I do medical simulation work. And I was teaching people how to get in and out of their PPE for high-risk medical procedures. I called it doing the spacewalk. I mean, we do some complicated stuff, getting people on life support, but having to do that, moving through a negative pressure room and getting in and out safely. God, the amount of PPE we go through is nuts. And, so I was reading somewhere, you guys make enough cobalt-60 to sterilize 20 billion pieces of PPE.
Yeah, that's right. So, and also our friends at Ontario Power Generation Pickering facility are also a producer at cobalt. And in fact, OPG is looking to expand that to Darlington. So I really want to give them a shout out as well. So we produce and harvest cobalt-60. It's what we call low specific activity cobalt-60 for the techies who are listening in. And that is harvested and used in sterilization. And in 2020, we harvested enough cobalt from the Bruce Power site between our Unit 5 and Unit 8 planned outages to sterilize up to 25 billion, either pairs of gloves, COVID swabs. I always like to share a few props, but Chris, this is the kind of stuff that you deal with every day. But, here's a dressing tray.
Yeah, I recognize it well.
You use, hopefully you don't have to use it too much. And, and sadly, here's a closed suction system package you probably use if you're intubating a patient. Yeah. The real sad thing about COVID-19 has really been the the demand in our ICUs, as you know better than anybody, for people on. But this is all sterile, and it's sterilized using, in many cases, overwhelmingly cobalt-60. And Canada is the world leader supply, and that supply comes from here in the province of Ontario. It comes from Bruce Power, it comes from Ontario Power Generation, and it's all processed by an Ottawa-based company in the case of Nordion. So, people, you cannot underestimate how critical that is. And I think it's going to grow in importance too. We think about getting ready for the next pandemic. We think about, as you noted, PPE. This is the highest volume, lowest cost, highest reliability way to sterilize single-use medical equipment. And it's really important that we continue to find ways of expanding our cobalt production in Canada and around the world.
So one of the other isotopes I was reading about, again, I'm an emergency practitioner, so I don't do a lot of cardiac diagnostics, beyond doing ECGs and things like that in the emergency department and blood work. But molybdenum and technetium-99, really short-lived medical isotopes. I imagine the logistics of getting these things out to the hospitals is pretty crazy. What was it? Molybdenum was it a 6-hour No, that was technetium's a 6-hour half-life, and I think molybdenum's like a 6-day half-life. And is that an example where you make the molybdenum in the power reactor, and then the technetium you kind of cook it with a cyclotron or a particle accelerator on site, so that it's, because like the technetium only lasts for a day basically, right? And it's used, for so many different things, a lot of cardiac testing, a lot of other diagnostic testing. But can you tell us about that isotope? Just for the nerds out there.
So it's obviously the one that people talk about the most because it's used in medical imaging. And I really have to, Bruce Power directly, we're not in the molybdenum-99 production business. That's something Ontario Power Generation is leading. In fact, they have a Dominic Minair and the team at Ontario Power Generation have a project at Darlington with BWXT Medical, where they are doing a little bit similar to what we're doing at Bruce Power and lutetium, but molybdenum is, as you noted, a much different type of isotope. And what they are doing is retrofitting the capability at Darlington to be able to produce large volumes of molybdenum-99. And they will process that in Canada. Think of molybdenum-99 as sort of the initial product, and technetium as it's usually, we refer to usually as a technetium generator. Think of technetium as the decay product of molybdenum-99.
Yeah.
So
the mother and the daughter.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the logistics are really important, but OPG is really stepping in here and doing something quite amazing with BWXT. BWXT, as you may be aware, a couple of years ago purchased the medical isotope arm of Nordion. So Nordion now is focused almost entirely on sterilization. BWXT purchased that medical isotope arm, and they are utilizing that medical isotope arm in partnership with OPG to produce large volumes of molybdenum-99. So I really got to credit OPG for their tremendous leadership in this space. And we're more focused on an isotope called lutetium at Bruce Power as our next isotope, and they're more focused on molybdenum. And it recognizes just the demands for all of these isotopes and how we just need us all working as a team and focusing on certain isotopes to get new supply to market.
Yeah, again, just the logistics. I heard when the NRU closed, they were estimating 76,000 patients were treated daily with isotopes from the NRU in 80 countries. So, especially this molybdenum, like it's probably being flown, right? You got to fly it to these countries because of the short half-life. It's got to get there quick.
Absolutely. And that's the case with a lot of isotopes. The TCM, there's a lot of logistics and supply chain involved in that.
So, this brings me to my next question, which is, the anti-nuclear folks, never find an excuse not to kind of protest, say, like the transport of nuclear waste or things like that. I haven't heard anyone making a peep about, protest the idea of, putting an isotope in an airplane and flying it around. The kind of like catastrophism that sort of characterizes their activism and sort of appeals to emotion and ideas of contamination and things like that. It's completely, I don't hear anything about that in terms of, but this is a major, way that we safely transport radioactive materials, literally like almost everywhere in the world, anywhere that has a modern healthcare system.
Yeah, and I mean, keep in mind too, these are short-lived isotopes. So they're isotopes that have the characteristics that you can use them in a patient. So they're very, very short-lived isotopes. I mean, folks, individuals who do not support nuclear power, I couldn't disagree with them more for, obviously, state the obvious. But it's very tough, even if you oppose the use of nuclear energy for electricity purposes. I don't know anybody that would stand up and say, we should not be producing medical isotopes to treat cancer and to sterilize medical equipment. And for somebody who doesn't think nuclear power has a role, I say to them, what are you going to say to the brain tumor patient who needs that high specific activity cobalt-60? What are you going to say, Chris, to a doctor like yourself who needs that sterilized PPE, or that patient who needs to be intubated? What are you going to say to the folks that need a cancer diagnostic scan with molybdenum-99? What are you going to say to the prostate cancer patient who needs lutetium-177? And the list goes on and on and on. And they don't have an answer, because there isn't an answer. We need nuclear power. It's not just about electricity and climate change. Nuclear power in our industry is part of, modern medical challenges. A modern medical system is based in a lot of technology, and this is what powers that technology. So it's okay to agree to disagree on nuclear power with people, but they can't have it both ways.
Yeah. No, I have a little saying. I like my climate cool, my air clean, and my surgical instruments sterile. So those are kind of my big threes, particularly as a physician, because bizarrely enough, there is quite a large anti-nuclear lobby in terms of the physician world, and that's starting to change a little bit, I think, as people become more aware of it. But it's really interesting as a doctor. If you look at a pie chart of the sources of radiation, I mean, we get vast majority, 85% is natural background, and then 15% is artificial. And of that 15%, 14% or 93% is medical. So I literally dose out radiation on every single shift I work. And it's just interesting because, I'll have patients who might otherwise be very scared of radiation in another context, say thinking about nuclear energy or thinking about a power plant. But they'll be literally begging me to do a CT scan on a baby that fell down and has a minor head injury. And, it is really interesting, I think, this idea that when there is a kind of individual or medical benefit to radiation, there's wide public acceptance. When there's a collective benefit, like, clean air or, zero emissions, climate protective energy, there tends to be more of an opportunity for opposition. So, it kind of reminds me of maybe antibiotics versus vaccines, and this idea that we need to sort of change the mentality a little bit and think a bit more about the common good. I don't know, maybe it's this sort of nostalgic thing of kind of looking back on previous generations when there was a bit more of an idea of sort of like collective good, civic duty, that kind of thing. But I just find that to be a pretty interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, Chris, I think you're right. And one of the things I'll tell you, I think our problem is, and I know you're not part of the nuclear industry, you're part of, you're really leading a citizens group. And so I know sometimes we look at the world a little differently, but from my perspective, Chris, I think the problem is that we perpetuate this myth that nuclear power is not supported. And let me just give you an example. We do polling every month in the province of Ontario to say, there's no point in polling in a province, what do you think of nuclear power, if they don't know anything about it because they don't need it because they have hydropower. So take a province like Ontario that has nuclear. Over 80% of people in Ontario every month for the last 6 years support the continued operation and life extension of our current fleet. 80%. If you got 80% of the vote in an election and you were an elected official, you would win every seat in the province of Ontario. So unanimous consent, we are never going to have it. And the problem, as I see it, is the 15 or even 10% that are opposed to nuclear power, and they're entitled to their opinion. That's a democracy. That's okay. They sound like they're 60%.
Yeah.
And I think we perpetuate a myth, especially with our policymakers, that it's not popular. It is popular. It's more popular than any political party in Ontario. And I think we need to let the silent majority be heard in these areas, and also stop apologizing for what we do. Do we have a technology that is perfect? No. No technology is perfect. I'm not going to ever stand here and tell you nuclear power is perfect, because it's not. But nor is wind or solar. nor is hydroelectric, right? And so this is about perfection can't be the enemy of the good. And as you noted, and I'm a listener to your podcast, and you look at countries like Germany. What have they done? They are losing the battle against climate change because they've closed their nuclear plants and they've opened coal plants. Like, how crazy is that? And I'm Scongack's German. My dad came over on it. We talked about my dad earlier. He came over on a boat from Germany. So, I won't get any Christmas dinner if I complain about German energy policy with my grandma. So don't tell her. But I think we need to stop apologizing and stop, let's not spend our lives trying to convince 10% of people that are never going to listen.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the positives and be proud, but also be honest of our gaps and just, it is what it is.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really big lesson, particularly for the sort of growing nuclear advocacy community. We tend to spend a lot of time online on Twitter or Facebook forums, arguing with, a tiny, tiny faction who bark a lot bark very loudly compared to, say, the size of the dog, right? And, but amongst that silent majority, there's not really an organized voice yet to date that can really, I think, channel that opinion and marshal it a little bit, because the task is urgent at this point with climate change. Nuclear phased out coal in Ontario. That's been called the greatest greenhouse gas reductions measure in North America. And these stories are not well told. I know Bruce Powers, tried in their information to put out the fact that 70% of that power came from Bruce, the other 20% from Pickering, starting up of reactors there. But and especially in like the formal government documents, it's totally glossed over or even not mentioned. So there is a real uphill battle there. But I think you're absolutely right that the messaging needs to be directed not at that vocal minority that will never be convinced, but more broadly at the population in general. And I mean, that's a difficult thing to do, but I think a really urgent task, again, given climate change, and I mean, given the isotope situation. Before we close off, this is an episode where I really want to focus on Canada and our contributions, but can you just talk a little bit more about, because I think, our use of heavy water and the CANDU itself, you've mentioned a couple of times, is responsible partially for why we're such a leader in isotopes in the world. What is it about the CANDU that, maybe for the more kind of tech nerd side of my audience that is so amenable to the production of medical isotopes?
Right. Well, the first thing I'll say is, as Canadians, we should be immensely proud of the CANDU technology that we operate in New Brunswick, in Ontario, at Bruce, Darlington, and Pickering. If you look at the track record of our CANDU reactors, they have served Canadians and they have served our communities in the world exceptionally well, from a safety, from a reliability, and the benefit of CANDU technology through the life extensions is going to go well beyond 50 years from now. So it is a technology that has been exceptional, and we ought to be very proud as Canadians. You talk about punching above your weight. The CANDU design, if there was ever a definition of punching above your weight, it'd be the CANDU design. In terms of medical isotope production, to simply put it, I sort of look at two characteristics of the CANDU design that I think lend itself very well for medical isotopes. For any of the nuclear techies out there, then Jeremy Whitlock and co would articulate this better than me. But the flux profile in a CANDU is incredibly attractive in terms of that irradiation process. And then in the case of Bruce, and I know it's the case in other CANDUs, we have access through previous startup instrumentation ports that we don't utilize anymore because of new technology that provide you access to that neutron source. So think about it as you sort of have a flux in the reactor that is attractive, and you have an access point to that neutron source that is readily and safely available.
So you're like, to make it really simple, it's like putting a loaf of cobalt 59 into the oven and bombarding it with neutrons and getting that cobalt 60 out. And you need, I guess, to do that. You need to do that for a specific amount of time. And the CANDU, because you kind of can do all this refueling online and put things in and take them out very easily. That's why the CANDU's Like, can
Yes.
be both? Because around the world, you don't hear about power reactors also making isotopes, like with pressurized light water designs, for instance.
No, that's right. Now, I mean, a lot of this isotope production that we're talking about for lutetium, it's done. It's not within the vault, so to speak. It's within an access point. But the one thing I would say is you use the oven as an example. What's also we find when we're doing this is, and I actually have a target here, Chris, if you don't mind me sharing it with you to explain this better. So this is our lutetium target. So this is what we will expose to neutrons and take ytterbium-176 and the lutetium-177. When we go and do the reactor analysis on this, we put this in the reactor. It doesn't even pick it up. So yes, you're putting it in an oven, but think about it like you go and you get cookie dough, and you get a little tiny speck of cookie dough, and you put it on a pan and put it in the oven. The oven doesn't even really notice that little speck of cookie dough is in there. It just does its normal thing. And so that's how I would think about a medical isotope like we're doing here. It's such a small impact also on the reactor that it's not it's not like you're doing cobalt or something like that. So it's significant, but it's significant in terms of its positive impact, but insignificant in terms of its impact on operations.
Yeah. I mean, I just, as a kind of proud Canadian, I don't feel like the CANDU gets quite enough credit. And, if there was an advanced reactor company that said, hey, like we've got this great reactor that can make medical isotopes and electricity at the same time, there'd be so much hype about it. But I think because the technology is mature and, we've developed it a while ago, I mean, I guess it's kind of new that we're using the power reactors now because we were doing it more with the NRU, which I guess is a reactor, again, based on that heavy water design. But I don't feel like the CANDU gets quite enough credit. It's pretty miraculous that it can make power and these isotopes.
But look, our friend, I mean, we're going to have CANDU technology here in Canada for the next 50 years. New Brunswick Power, Darlington, Bruce Power. We're going to have a massive CANDU fleet for the next 50 years. And SNC-Lavalin is doing some great work in this space. They are looking at CANDU new builds internationally. I would not be surprised if we do see a CANDU new build here in Canada. The future of nuclear is really about building on your foundation of your current assets. There's a look at microreactors for certain applications, whether it's the Westinghouse Da Vinci. Obviously, a lot of dialogue on small modular reactors. But look, there is going to be a future in Canada for large commercial reactors. Yeah. There has to be, with the amount of power the world needs to fight climate change. We need these large commercial reactors as well. So it's not about one's better than the other. It's about the mix. And what I'll tell you is the most important thing we need to focus on in Canada the next 3 to 5 years is securing the foundation of the existing fleet. It's great to talk about all these extra things, and I think we should talk about them. But those only work if we complete all the refurbishments at Bruce, all the refurbishments at Darlington, and all of the challenges we have ahead of us. Remember, our existing new CANDU fleet has the opportunity to increase its output from its existing fleet. Bruce Power, we are now producing 6,400 megawatts of electricity. When we started our refurbishment program, it was 6,300. So there's also optimizing the fleet. By optimizing the fleet, that's the same amount of output as 3 or 4 SMRs. So we need to think of the mix and not cannibalize ourselves. We've got a suite of products and a suite of options. And depending on what problem we want to solve, we pick the right technical option for the problem. We shouldn't pick the technical option and then make it fit, right? As a doctor, you will pick the right surgical tool for the right activity. We don't give you a scalpel and say,
you got to use this one.
Patient needs, use a scalpel. No, we pick the right tool for the right problem.
Yeah. No, I mean, it just strikes me that, our supply chain is very well developed because of these refurbishments. There's, this supply chain that's 95% made in Canada. There's a lot of benefits to continuing on with the humble CANDU. Just as a closing question, again, just to give our listeners a sense of, I was trying to get a percentage, I guess, of, cobalt 60, say, that we put out into the world and just quantifying that punching above our weight. How much do we put out there?
Well, cobalt, if you look at the world of if you take the amount of cobalt that's produced around the world, between Canada would be well over half, if not 2/3 of that cobalt supply. Obviously, it depends on the year. I mean, we sterilize medical equipment using many different processes. If you separate out the irradiation piece that Nordion supplies, we would be half to 2/3 of the world. So that's massive.
That's crazy.
And without these units, I'm telling you that we wouldn't have that supply because it's not coming from anywhere else.
Wow. All right, James, I think we'll wrap it up there. It's been a really entertaining conversation. I've learned a lot.
Thanks for having me, and I follow all your work, Chris, and I think as a civil society group, I think you do just a fantastic job of getting these messages out and also challenging the industry and asking the industry some tough questions, which we deserve as well. So thank you for everything you do.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we'll talk soon.
Take care. We'll see you later.
We can do it. We can do it. This is not the time to shirk. We can do it.
Thank you so much for joining us on the We Can Do It podcast. Be sure to like, review, and subscribe.